Hi everybody, my name is Afua Adjei and I am a current Masters by Research student here at Trobe University. Today I'm going to be talking to you about my current research with Trobe University and James Cook University on vertebral pathologies at Ban On Wat. Happy National Archaeology Week! So I thought I would talk a little bit about my journey at La Trobe to start off with. So my journey started in 2017 and I was enrolled in a Bachelor of Arts majoring in history. I then took a first year subject, an elective in archaeology, and I was immediately hooked. So I then transferred into a Bachelor of Arts majoring in archaeology and then eventually switched into a Bachelor of Archaeology that La Trobe had recently reintroduced. So once I finished my undergraduate degree, I was pretty certain that I wanted to continue into research. So I decided to do an honours year in 2021. And the honours year was a really great introduction into research, and it allowed me to explore my specific passions within the realm of archaeology, as well as taking core subjects that were really important to all archaeological research. I was then told of a new program that La Trobe was introducing called the Masters by Research pathway. This pathway involved completing your honours year, and then depending on your honours thesis grade, you could then transfer into a Masters by Research program instead of officially graduating with an honours degree. You then are given another 8 months to bump up your honours thesis into a Masters by Research thesis. And this program is a really good way to ease students who are coming straight out of their undergraduate degree or perhaps who haven't been at uni for a while to get into the field of research. So I'm going to be first giving a quick rundown of my honours research, which I completed last year. And then at the end of this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about my Masters by Research thesis, so that little extra part of my thesis to bump that up to a Masters thesis. So my research last year and this year is focusing on a site called Ban On Wat, which is in northeastern Thailand. It is a prehistoric site, and I am going to be looking at two vertebral pathologies. I looked at vertebral osteophytosis in my honours year, and then I'll be adding another pathology in my master's year this year. So Ban On Wat spans from the early Neolithic to the late Iron Age, and I had two aims of my research for my honours thesis. My two aims were to determine the prevalence of vertebral osteophytosis by age, sex, time period, and vertebral region, and to determine if a correlation existed between the rates of vertebral osteophytosis and changes in wider society. I hypothesized that there would be an increase in the rates of vertebral osteophytosis both within the older population and within the female population, and that the rate of the pathology would increase with the intensification of agriculture. I also hypothesized that the highest rate of vertebral osteophytosis will be present in the lumbar region, and these hypotheses were supported by the archaeological and clinical literature. So what is vertebral osteophytosis? So vertebral osteophytosis is a joint disease that affects the intervertebral joint, more specifically the fibrocartilaginous joints between the discs of the vertebral body. It results in extra bone growth that grows over the superior and inferior lips of the vertebral body, which you can see on the image to the left here. It has a multifactorial etiology, so there are lots of things that can cause VOP, including increasing age, so it's much more common in older individuals than younger individuals. Sex, the clinical literature does suggest that females are more predisposed to the disease than males. Genetic predisposition, there is new research coming out that suggests a link between certain genes and VOP. And BMI and physical activities, so individuals that have a higher BMI have been shown in some clinical literature to be more predisposed to getting VOP compared to individuals with a lower BMI. And heavy repetitive physical activity can also lead to the bone spurs. And the bone spurs or osteophytes are sort of the joint's reaction to that physical trauma, and they're creating extra bone growth to increase the surface area to protect the spine from further damage. So just a quick rundown of my results that I got from last year's analyses. There was a higher proportion of males with pathological VOP compared to females, despite there being a higher number of females in the sample and despite the clinical literature suggesting females are more predisposed to VOP than males. So I tried to think of why there might be this difference between VOP, and I tried to explore the idea of a sexual division of labor. However, it's known within the literature that VOP can't be used alone to determine differences in activity. So I used diet, mortuary offerings, and trauma to sort of supplement my theory of a sexual division of labor. So there was a difference in the diet that males and females at Ban Non Wat were eating, which may suggest that they were partaking in different hunting and gathering activities, which might suggest sexual division of labor. There was no sexual division in mortuary offerings. Both males and females had very similar things within their graves. And there was no instances of trauma at Ban Non Wat, but I did want to explore this a little bit more, so I looked at a comparative site called Non Ban Jak, which is geographically very close to Ban Non Wat, and Ban Non Wat and Non Ban Jak had a very similar proportional difference of VOP between males and females, so that's why I used that site as a comparative site. There was a higher proportion of males at Non Ban Jak that had trauma compared to females, but I still couldn't, confidently say that yes, there was definitely a sexual division of labor at Ban Non Wat. There was a higher proportion of mid-old adults with pathological VOP, which was to be expected and supported in the clinical literature. However, there were also a higher number of mid-old adults within the subsample. Similarly, there was a higher number of Bronze Age individuals within the sample, and there also was a higher proportion of pathological VOP in the Bronze Age, so that might be a preservation bias. I'm not entirely sure. The highest proportion of pathological VOP was in the lumbar, which is clinically supported, followed by the cervical, then the lower thoracic, then the upper thoracic. And that was to be expected as the lumbar is the main load-bearing region in the spine. And finally, the higher rates of VOP in the Bronze Age might be linked to the increased rate in agriculture. So an increase in agriculture, potentially people were working harder, working more often, which might lead to an increase in physical activity. And if you remember, physical activity is one of the etiological factors of VOP. There was also an increase in ceramic production and weaving production, which is evidenced by the increase of ceramic pots and weaving tools in the graves from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age. And the rate of VOP from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age was not statistically significant, but there was still an increase from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age. So what I will be adding to this year's research as part of my master's is second pathology, vertebral osteoarthritis, osteobiographies, and vertebral osteoarthritis at Non Ban Jak. So vertebral osteoarthritis is another degenerative joint disease, but instead of affecting the fibrocartilaginous joint within the intervertebral joint, it affects the zygapophyseal joint. So in the top right-hand corner, that diagram, what I've circled red, that is the zygapophyseal joint, as opposed to the inferior and superior lips of the vertebral body, which is associated with vertebral osteophytosis. So vertebral osteoarthritis is the degradation of the articular cartilage, which you can see in the bottom left diagram there. And so the degradation of this articular cartilage is pretty much the definition of vertebral osteoarthritis. And then that results in the subchondral bone on either side of the articular cartilage coming into contact with each other. And during movement, they will rub against each other. And as the subchondral bone has nerves in it, that can be quite painful, as the articular cartilage doesn't have nerve endings in it. And it helps for the smooth movement of the bone on either side. But without that articular cartilage, you get that rubbing bone-to-bone painful contact. So severe vertebral osteoarthritis, I'm sure, is a very painful disease to have. And And so that bone-on-bone contact is called ebonation. And when you see ebonation on a bone in an archaeological context, if you shine it to the light right, it produces like a shiny ivory-like look to it. So if you know what to look for, ebonation is pretty easy to see. And ebonation is a definite like if you see ebonation, you definitely have vertebral osteoarthritis. The second thing that I will be looking at will be osteobiographies. And so osteobiographies, you basically get all the information you possibly have on an archaeological individual. So you look at their sex, their age, their stature, what time period they came from, the archaeological context, so where they were buried, how they were buried, what they were buried with, any trauma, any other pathologies that they might have had, if we know whether they were born at that site or whether they migrated. You get all the information you have on an individual, archaeological and biological, and then you put that all together to get a life history of an individual. And osteobiographies are a good way of contextualizing an individual, but they're also a really good way to reconnect archaeological remains with the individual that they once belonged to, which I think is important. So I think it's important to distinguish between, yes, you're looking at archaeological remains, but this also was, you know, a living person once. So it's important to, I think, make that connection. And osteobiographies are a really good way of doing that. And third, I will be looking at non-Banjak. So I use non-Banjak in my honours to try and determine whether a sexual division of labour occurred at Bandon Wat. I'm also going to be looking at vertebral osteoarthritis at non-Banjak and comparing vertebral osteoarthritis at non-Banjak and Bandon Wat, just to see if there are any differences of note there. So that is it. That was my research that I conducted at La Trobe as part of my honours last year, and the research that I'm conducting at La Trobe as part of my master's thesis this year. So at the moment, I've just finished my results and I'm about to jump into my first osteobiography, which is very exciting. So thank you for listening. I will leave my contact details if you have any questions or want to get in contact or just ask about my research. And happy National Archaeology Week.